Dorico has so many powerful features that help a composer interface with MIDI information, which makes it invaluable for a DAW to a notation workflow. So today I'm going to show you how to use it in a way where you might have a MIDI mockup that sounds great in Cubase, but now you need it notated, and how to do that in Dorico. So let's get started. Now here's a project that I have opened up in Cubase. This is an excerpt from a larger piece of music, and this is written for orchestra. And as you can see, I have various tracks for the same instrument, but utilizing different techniques and different key switches, which is a common way to work in a DAW. So I have a couple tracks for long style playing, a couple tracks for short, other kinds of special techniques, and that goes for each of these instruments. Okay, let me show you a little bit of it. Okay, so that's something that I had put together previously. Now let's assume that I want to potentially record a live orchestra later on. And so I want to send this MIDI information to Dorico in order to do that. This is actually a very common workflow in scoring. So you might work with footage in a DAW like Cubase, using all your sample libraries, making it sound really good, and then sending that MIDI information to Dorico to then put together the sheet music that musicians will then read later on. I've done this exact workflow on my own personal projects. I've assisted other composers working to film using this workflow as well, and so that's what I'm showing you how to do today. However, you can work with footage directly in Dorico, and I've made a 4-part series all about that on the official Dorico YouTube channel. So go and check out those videos. I think there's a very compelling workflow there for you to consider. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to export this project as a MIDI file. So let's do that now. I'll go to File, Export, MIDI file. This is called In the Forest, MIDI. Let's just save it to the desktop. I'll export the automation, export markers, sure, and I'll leave those on. Exporting all of my tracks. Now I'll open Dorico. By the way, if you're using this kind of workflow, especially in a scoring context, then maybe you won't want to export your synths or your what they call prelays, which are all of the instruments that you have recorded that you don't want to necessarily record or have appear on a score. If you want it to appear on the score, that's no problem. You can export those parts, but just in case. Okay, so I've opened Dorico. I'm going to hit open or import file. Let's head to the desktop. I have my In the Forest MIDI track here. I'll go ahead and open that. Now, this is the MIDI import options dialog. Now, this is where Dorico's power really comes into play. So here's what we're looking at. On the left here, you'll notice that these are the tracks of all of the instruments we use in the Cubase project. They are all here under MIDI track name. This little figure denotes whether Dorico is going to treat each of these parts as a single player or as a section. In this case, I'll want the strings to be sections, and I'll keep everything else as single players. Now, here is where Dorico is trying to determine what instrument these MIDI tracks belong to. So looking at this briefly, I see that these are accurate piccolo, flute, oboe, cor anglais, bassoon, horns. I see here that Dorico determined the tenor trombone longs track to be the lead part. I'll just say trombone, C, bass clef. Okay, now that's been fixed. Tuba, timpani. Here, the ARO alt bass drum is just using a sample library where one of the bass drums is called the alt bass drum. So let me just look for bass drum here, and I'll just add that. Again, I'll add a taiko for the taikos here. Crash cymbal sounds good. Tam-tam, piano, harp, violin, 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 violin. Now, here, Dorico has determined a few things about the violins. So these are violins, that's correct. Here, Dorico has labeled this as a treble staff. This is part of the sketch family of instruments in Dorico. So I'll go ahead and correct that. These are violas, cello, and here instead of bass guitar, I'm gonna go with contrabass. Okay, those have been corrected. Now they are properly in the strings family of instruments. Now, as I mentioned before, I have split out a lot of these instruments into long styles of playing and shorter styles of playing. Legato, shorts, that's all pretty typical of playing, and those aren't necessarily techniques, but those are just styles of playing. Now here for the basses, the name of this track is Basses, Pizz, Col, Leg. That stands for contrabasses, pizzicato, Colegno. So all of my pizzicato tracks, all of my Colegno tracks, those styles of playing are on these dedicated tracks. So I'm gonna go ahead and let Dorico know that there is pizzicato in this track. That way Dorico will know to add the proper playing technique to this track when it opens the notated way. In addition to the family here, you can see this destination instrument tile. And in order to talk about this, let me go to the advanced editor. Let me make this bigger so we can see everything that's going on. Now you can see to the right, it added a few things, these track settings and all the players in the Dorico project. Now, to me, everything looks pretty good, except for one thing. So the flute's A3 legato. A3 is referring to the fact that there are 3 flute players playing the same thing at the same time in unison. So right now, Dorico only has 1 flute player on this track. So I'll go ahead and hit this duplicate button to add these 3 instruments. Okay, now Dorico has added these extra 2 flutes. Now these correspond to the actual flute parts that will be created in Dorico. In this case, there will be 3 of them. Let's do the same thing for the oboes. Let's go ahead and duplicate again. Clarinets, let's make 3 of them. Bassoons, 3 bassoons. That's a lot of bassoons. Now here for horns, A4. Now there are 4 players playing the exact same thing. So go ahead and make that. Now you can see here in the instruments in this track, I added 4, but down on the right, you'll see the players in the Dorico project goes down to 5. So here's what's going on. The horn legato is a single horn. That's being added to horn 1, and then subsequent horns have horn 2, and then it goes on from there. So let me correct that. The first horn here will be first horn, second horn will be second, third, fourth. Okay, now it's been fixed, that looks good. Now the tenor trombone longs track is technically 1 player. However, in the longs style of playing, you can play multiple notes at the same time. So instead of having 1 tenor trombone, I can see over here that the maximum similar notes as the notes that are playing at the same time is 3. That means that I should add 3 trombone players to this track and not just have 1. So let me duplicate this twice. Now you can see that there are 3 tenor trombones that are going to be added. So having this is very helpful to know just how many I'm going to need. So for the violins 1, you'll see that the violin 1 section track is added here. Violins 2 here. And then for the violins 2 shorts, it's added a 3rd violin part. I don't want that, so I'll just give that to the 2nd violin part. So now we only have 2 violins, the first violins, 2nd violins, including the legato style playing and the short style playing. Violas, looks good. Cello, contrabass. Again, Dorico has split out these 2 tracks, so let me correct this one. We only need 1 contrabass track. Now, this means that when I create our project, these 2 tracks will be combined onto 1 staff. They won't be separated because I'm telling Dorico that they both belong on the violin 2 part. Again, you can play with playing techniques using the instruments that you've had from Cubase and into Dorico. Here you can say that the playing technique is pizzicato, arco. Now, the great thing about this is that Dorico will remember these names and what settings you apply to these track names. So if you have a template set up in Cubase, when you export those same MIDI tracks again and send them to Dorico, Dorico will remember, this track name was this. Let me apply these settings as before to these tracks. So you don't have to do this process again once you've done it once. Okay, now lastly down here, there's this import options section. And if I hit that, you'll see some things. So if you want, for example, Dorico to detect slurs, that's if maybe notes in the MIDI are overlapping, you might want that slurred. If they're a little separated, that may not be slurred. If you want to preserve note velocities for playback in Dorico specifically. Now here's an important part. This quantize options, I'm going to hit that. This is if your MIDI is perhaps not exactly locked to the grid, which is common to do because sometimes specific tracks may need some compensation when it comes to timing. So the start of a MIDI note may have a little delay only because the start of the audio file is the beginning of a player, say, bowing a string. And there's just a few milliseconds before the actual start of the note after the initial MIDI hit. So if you need to nudge your MIDI information over just a little bit in order for the timing to be right, that may look really crazy if you look at it in notation, where there are 64th notes and 32nd notes and 30-second rests all over the place because of those little nudges in time. So you can ask Dorico to quantize everything to a specific grid. If you want to detect tuplets, I don't think I have any tuplets in this excerpt. We can change all this later, by the way, if we determine that we do need tuplet detection. So I'll go ahead and just set the quantization unit. I think 16 notes is about as complicated as we get in this. I'll hit OK. Now let's make our project. I'll hit OK in the MIDI import options dialog. Cool. Now Dorico has created a project. Let's check it out first. So it's made this page. All of the instruments that we asked it to make, it made. The string section looks completely intact. Everything looks good there. The woodwinds, 3 flute tracks, 3 oboe tracks, 3 clarinets, 3 bassoons, 4 horns, 3 trombones, a tuba, timpani, percussion section, piano, harp. All of that was in the MIDI information. It also imported my markers, which I wanted, but in this case, I'm not going to show them in the score. So I'm going to go ahead and head to layout options, which I use Shift Command L, that's Shift Control L on Windows machines. Head to markers and I'll untick show markers. And then because this is only one flow, let me again head to layout options, page setup, flows, and I'll just say never show flow headings. That tightens up the page a little bit. Now, because of our quantize option, Dorico has interpreted a lot of these as 16th notes. So let me select all of these parts. I'll go to Edit, Requantize, and let me just select 8th notes. Now here, Dorico has tightened up these notes. You'll also see in the contrabass part, Dorico has added the proper playing technique, which is the pizzicato technique. This isn't text. This isn't just here for show. A playing technique in Dorico, we can just open the playing techniques panel here. The pizzicato playing technique will actually make sure that the pizzicato trigger is playing back when you play this information. Now I can also see that Dorico has added some staccatos in the MIDI information. That's probably because some notes are shorter than others. So Dorico is interpreting those. Maybe these pizzicato notes don't need these staccatos because they're already pizzicato. That's a little unnecessary there. Now, something you may notice is that there are no dynamics. Dorico isn't looking at the velocity information or any of the automation to determine dynamics. There's just so much variation. I feel like that would be a difficult thing to try and interpret. So the job of, say, an orchestrator in a Hollywood film scoring workflow is to take the MIDI information from a composer, usually from a DAW like Cubase, taking it into a notation software, and then adding all the musical elements that a player would be used to seeing. So this is a very quick way of doing that. Okay, so let's look at this project a little further. So we see all these notes, there's slurs, little runs here and there. Now you may notice that there are a lot of red notes in this harp part. That's because they are out of range for the harp. And what that means is for the pedaling that is set up in Dorico for the harp right now, these just don't fit. So what I'll do is just select all of these measures. I'll hit J to activate the jump bar. I'll hit calculate harp pedals. Do the same thing here. Again here. Now these signposts have appeared. That is telling me that there is something in the actual part. So if we go to the part, I'll hit W with selection. Now you'll see the harp pedal markings have been written in automatic. So this just lets the harp player know what pedals to change. So for example, D flat, move that to D for these measures, move that to D flat, etc. Okay, now let's do some adjustments here. I'm going to select all of this, Command A or Control A, and I'll invoke the jump bar again and filter slurs. Now, Dorico has shown me every slur in this part. In this case, there are only 2. I'll go ahead and delete those. I don't think they're necessary. I'm going to select again. I'll hit the right bracket key, which is the staccato key. Now it's applied staccato to all of these notes. I'll hit it again to turn them off. That means all the staccatos that were in here are now gone. Okay, let's go back to the full score. Now you may find that this page is kind of large and there are a lot of instruments on here. Now, because Dorico knows that all of these instruments belong to the same type of instrument, I can go over here to edit, turn on condensing. Now, Dorico has condensed all of these tracks to one track and they'll be properly split out. So you'll see that these notes are A3, as in all three flutes are going to be playing this part, which is exactly how I had it in Cubase. Now, I can't edit notes while they're condensed, so I'll go ahead and turn that off so I can make sure that I can still affect all of the instruments that I want to. So if I was orchestrating this, I would scan through all of this. Here is a moment where this is quantized to the 16th note, but I can tell that I'm sure I'm meant for that to start on beat 3, but in Cubase I was just a little late, so it's not exactly on 3, but on the 16th note right after beat 3. So let me go down to my resolution for my grid, set it to 16 notes, hit Option and then left on the arrow key to move that over, and I'll hold Shift and then Option, then the right arrow key to make it slightly longer. That way it's 3 like this. I also know that this was a roll. In Cubase, it wasn't several notes going at the same time, but instead one MIDI note which triggered the sound of a tam-tam roll. So Dorico didn't interpret it as that. So let me hit Shift R for repeat. I'll say 3 and then rel for release, as in releasing on the beat there. Looks good. Let me add some dynamics. So Shift D to invoke the dynamics popover, P, crescendo to forte. Let me bring that back a little bit. Great. Now what I would continue doing is the same sort of process, adjusting timing here and there. The Requantize option is a wonderful option to have in Dorico. In this case, some of my MIDI notes are over by just a 16th, so Dorico is correctly interpreting those. So I'm going in and fixing them because I probably don't want it played exactly like that. So that would be a case where, say, an orchestrator on a film will have the audio to reference so that they make sure all of the timing is correct on the parts and all the correct styles of playing show up. But having those options, the MIDI import options, where you can determine, for example, that there is the pizzicato playing technique for one part because that was a separate track in Cubase, and then importing into here and then goes to Arco, is wonderful to have because that's another step that doesn't have to be done by a person. Dorico's already doing that based on the information that it has. But if Dorico hadn't interpreted all of this MIDI information like it did, I promise you, I've seen it in other notation softwares, this would just look very hairy. It would take a long time to clean up. In fact, there are dedicated jobs where a composer will hire an assistant specifically to clean up the MIDI in their DAW so that when it's sent to a notation software, it doesn't look so crazy. Here, it's barely an issue. I have to correct a 16th note here and there, but if I had no requantization options ticked, this would probably just look crazy because of all the timing considerations when it comes to listening to something in a DAW, like I've mentioned. Now, I won't show you the process of exporting all of this music to record for live players. I've gone over that in the 4-part series of scoring to picture in Dorico. That was in part 4, so go check out those videos. There's a lot of great information there. Now, here really quickly is another workflow that may or may not appeal to you depending on how you work. So back in Cubase, let me open Cubase again. Now here in Cubase, you can select all of your tracks, for example, and open the score editor. Now here you can see that Cubase is showing me all of my tracks notated just like in Dorico. Now here you could add different symbols. For example, if you wanted the horns part to be fortissimo, I'll just go ahead and add that right there. So if you use the score editor in Cubase to add dynamics or slurs or hairpins, then you can export as MusicXML to then import into Dorico, so all of those things remain intact. The trade-offs there are if you export MusicXML, then you don't bring over any of the performance nuances that were programmed into Cubase, and you can't use Requantize to further clean up the notation once you have it. But you can be sure that the notation you see in Cubase will be what appears in Dorico. So it will match the display quantize that you have in Cubase, which is almost the equivalent of a Requantize feature in Dorico. So if you're purely focused on MIDI editing in Cubase, then you can export that MIDI and use Dorico's smart MIDI import options like I showed you, which I think is very powerful. If you prefer to check and alter your notation directly in Cubase, export via MusicXML so that all of that remains intact and you can use Dorico's powerful features to take that notation even further. So that's all I have for you today. Leave any questions you may have down in the comments below. Make sure you're subscribed to the Dorico YouTube channel, and you can check out my channel where I document my own composing work, make score study videos, and videos on music technology like Dorico. That link will be in the description down below. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.